There's a room in many traditional Japanese homes that has almost nothing in it. No furniture crowding the corners, no shelves lined with objects. Just a woven tatami floor, a single scroll hanging on one wall, and maybe one small arrangement of flowers sitting quietly in an alcove. That's it. That's the whole room. If you showed this room to most people around the world and asked them to describe it, many would use the word unfinished. Where's the couch? Where's the entertainment center? Where's all the stuff that's supposed to go here? But step inside that room and something strange happens. Your breathing slows down a little. Your mind, which was probably racing with a dozen thoughts a moment ago, quiets. There's nothing demanding your attention, so your attention finally has somewhere calm to rest. This isn't an accident, and it isn't poverty or minimalism as a trend. It's a centuries-old design philosophy that treats emptiness itself as something valuable, maybe even more valuable than anything you could put inside that space. And once you understand why, you may never look at a cluttered room the same way again. Let's start with a concept that sits at the very center of this idea: ma. It's a Japanese word that doesn't translate cleanly into English, which is part of why it's so rarely discussed outside of design and philosophy circles. The closest approximation is negative space, or the pause between things, but even that undersells it. Ma isn't simply the absence of objects. It's treated as a substance in its own right, as real and as intentional as the objects that surround it. In traditional Japanese thinking, the empty space in a room isn't a gap waiting to be filled. It's an active participant in how the room functions, feels, and is experienced. This idea shows up far beyond architecture. In traditional Japanese music, ame refers to the silence between notes, a pause that isn't a lack of sound, but a deliberate, meaningful part of the composition itself. Musicians are trained to treat that silence with as much care as the notes they actually play. In calligraphy, ma refers to the untouched white space around the brushstrokes, which is considered just as essential to the artwork as the ink itself. A calligraphy piece with too little empty space feels crowded and anxious to the trained eye, regardless of how skillfully the characters are drawn. Bring this concept into a home, and you get rooms that feel radically different from what most of the world considers complete. A traditional Japanese room, called a washitsu, often contains only a few carefully chosen elements: tatami mat flooring, a low table, perhaps a single cushion, and an alcove called a tokonoma, a small recessed space reserved specifically for one seasonal flower arrangement or a single hanging scroll. Everything else is left open, left empty, left alone. Now, here's where this becomes genuinely interesting from a psychological standpoint, because there's real science behind why this kind of space feels so calming. And it's not simply a cultural preference. Our brains are constantly processing visual information, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. Every object in a room, its shape, its color, its position, its purpose, requires a small amount of cognitive processing just to register and categorize. Neuroscientists studying visual attention have found that cluttered environments create something called attentional competition. Multiple objects essentially competing for your brain's limited attention resources, even when you're not actively looking at any of them directly. This is why a cluttered room can feel exhausting, even when you're just sitting quietly in it, doing nothing. Your brain isn't idle. It's continuously scanning, processing, and filtering dozens of visual inputs all at once without you ever consciously deciding to do so. Multiply this by every room you spend time in throughout your day, and you begin to understand why so many people report feeling a kind of low-grade, hard-to-name fatigue by the end of an ordinary day at home. Fatigue that has nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the sheer volume of visual information their environment demanded they process. An empty room, by contrast, offers almost none of this competition. There's little to categorize, little to track, little pulling your attention in different directions. This is precisely why stepping into a space shaped by ame often produces an almost immediate physiological shift. A genuine, measurable settling of the nervous system, not just a poetic feeling. There's a related concept worth introducing here: yohaku no bi, which translates roughly to the beauty of blank space, or the beauty of the unnecessary. This idea appears throughout traditional Japanese art forms: poetry, painting, garden design, architecture, and it rests on a fairly radical premise for most modern audiences, that what's left out of a composition can be just as important, sometimes more important, than what's included. Consider a traditional Japanese rock garden, where a few carefully placed stones sit within a much larger expanse of raked gravel. A Western instinct, trained by decades of maximalist design and the belief that more content equals more value, might look at that garden and see wasted space. An opportunity to add more stones, more plants, more visual interest. But the raked gravel isn't wasted at all. It's doing something crucial. It's giving your eye and your mind room to actually see the few stones that are there. Without that empty space surrounding them, the stones would simply become part of a crowded visual field, competing with everything else for attention, and ultimately saying much less. This same principle applies directly to how a room is furnished. A single, well-chosen object in an otherwise empty room draws real attention and holds real meaning. That same object, placed among 20 other things, becomes background noise, present but essentially invisible to a mind that's already overloaded with visual information. Let's bring in a bit more psychology here, because this connects to something researchers call hedonic adaptation. Human beings, it turns out, adapt remarkably quickly to their surroundings. An object that felt exciting or meaningful when you first acquired it tends to fade into the visual background within days or weeks, becoming just another piece of the environment your brain has learned to tune out. This is part of why accumulating more possessions so often fails to produce lasting satisfaction. Your brain simply adjusts to the new baseline, and the excitement quietly disappears, leaving you looking for the next thing to fill the space. A room shaped by Emma works against this pattern almost by design. Because there's so little in the space, the few objects that are present resist becoming invisible. They're not competing with clutter for your attention, so they don't fade into background noise the way objects in a crowded room eventually do. A single flower in an alcove, changed seasonally, remains genuinely noticeable, genuinely present week after week in a way that a shelf crowded with decorations simply cannot. There's also an emotional dimension to Ma worth exploring, one that goes beyond aesthetics and psychology into something closer to how we relate to time and mortality. Traditional Japanese aesthetics are deeply influenced by Buddhist philosophy, particularly the concept of impermanence, the understanding that all things, including this exact moment, are temporary and constantly changing. An empty room in this context isn't simply about visual calm, it's a physical embodiment of impermanence itself. The space isn't fixed or finished, it's open, ready to become whatever the next moment requires. A place for meditation, for a tea ceremony, for sleeping, for simply sitting in silence. A room filled with permanent furniture locks itself into one identity. An empty room remains, in a sense, alive with possibility. This connects to something the tea ceremony master Sen no Rikyu is said to have emphasized centuries ago: that a room should never announce its wealth or its owner's status through excess. Instead, its beauty should come from restraint, from what has been deliberately left out, not from what has been proudly put in. This wasn't simply an aesthetic preference. It reflected a deeper value, that humility, simplicity, and presence matter more than display. Now, let's bring this back to something practical, because appreciating a philosophy is only useful if it changes how you actually live. You don't need an entire empty room to benefit from this principle. Most modern homes, understandably, need furniture, storage, and function in every space, but the underlying idea can still be applied on a much smaller scale. Consider choosing one surface in your home, a shelf, a small table, a corner of a room, and deliberately leaving it empty or nearly so. Not because you haven't gotten around to decorating it yet, but as an intentional choice. Notice how your eye and your mind respond to that space differently than they respond to the more crowded surfaces around it. You might also try what many people who practice minimalist design call the one-object rule for small, meaningful spaces. Rather than filling a shelf or a tabletop with many decorative items, choose a single object that actually matters to you, and give it the space to be genuinely seen. This mirrors exactly what a Takanoma alcove does with its single flower or scroll, concentrating attention rather than diffusing it. There's a final, important nuance worth mentioning before we close, because it would be easy to romanticize all of this into something impractical. Ma isn't about deprivation. It's not about having less simply for the sake of having less. And it's certainly not about eliminating comfort, function, or personality from your space. A room shaped by Emma isn't empty, because emptiness itself is the goal. It's empty because emptiness allows the few things that remain to actually matter, to be seen, to be felt, to be experienced fully, rather than lost in visual noise. So why does having an empty room make Japanese homes feel peaceful? Not because emptiness is inherently superior to fullness, but because emptiness gives your mind somewhere to rest, gives your attention somewhere calm to land, and gives the few objects that remain the space they need to actually be noticed, rather than disappearing into an overcrowded, overstimulating environment that your brain has to work constantly, quietly, and exhaustingly to process. Peace, it turns out, isn't always something you add to a room. Sometimes it's what's left when you finally stop adding. Maybe the fullest room isn't the one with the most in it. Maybe it's the one that finally gives you, and your mind, room enough to breathe. Is there a space in your own home, a shelf, a corner, a room, that might feel more peaceful with a little less in it? If this changed how you think about the spaces you live in, A-Like helps this reach more people looking for that same sense of calm. And if you'd enjoy more reflections like this one, subscribing means the next video finds you when you need it. Feel free to share this with someone who might appreciate a little more breathing room in their own home.